Okay, so let's have the first slide, please. We are, as has just been said, concluding our series on mission, looking at it through the lens of the book of Acts, and the title this morning is Mission, Persevering Through the Storms, or Persevering Through the Storms of Life. Last time I spoke, I had exactly the same slide layout, except it was tongues of fire in the background. This time it's something slightly different in the background. And before I go any further, I want to address what might be, for some of you, the elephant in the room, which is that it is, air quotes, interesting that this subject has fallen to me. For those of you who don't know, and most of you do, I and my family are in the middle of a storm in life right now. So it is perhaps fitting that I talk about this subject, not because I've got all the answers, because believe me, and as you will hear, I have not got all the answers. What I have got is an awareness of more of the questions, I guess. I know a lot more about the questions than I once did. But equally, I don't want to make this all personal and focused on the particular issues I've got. I know in this room there will be myriad storms that people are facing, have been facing. So I don't want to just make it personal. I just wanted to put it in a context, because as Anthea so correctly reminded us in her talk last week, context is really important. So let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture, of course, is that we are talking about mission through the book of Acts. And we have asked this question several times. The question has been asked, what is mission? What is this thing called mission? And of course, as a lot of you in this room will be aware, there's all sorts of verses we could go to if we're talking about mission. And this is just a very quick, off the top of my head, selection of them, and some of the better known ones, except possibly the last one. So Matthew 28, Jesus says to the disciples, I want you to go into all of the world and make disciples. And that's often the go-to verse for talking about mission. In Acts 1:8, he says, you will be my witnesses here and a bit further field and a bit further field again, Jerusalem, Samaria, the uttermost parts of the earth. And we can talk about that, mission at home, and then in the wider community, and then perhaps, at least for some of us, much further afield. In Matthew 5, Jesus talks about the fact that we are called to be salt and light in this world. And we're called to be salt and light in the community. And some people want to focus on that it's just about, who we are, where we are, the light that we show, the salt that we bring, make the flavor better, all of that stuff. John 13 is where Jesus talks to his disciples and said, it's by the love you show for each other that the world will know that you're my disciples. So, in mission, we need to think about how we show love, at least starting here, but not just here. How do we show love to one another? What witness is that to the world of something different in the love that we show? And then the last one, which you might be wondering what that is, 1 John 1 and verse 1, and it's actually the verse that I landed on as my sort of model for mission when I was talking about mission when I was doing the job with Links International, which is where John talks about the fact when Jesus came, the word of life, this was a word of life that they heard, that they saw, and that is explained twice, and one Greek word means more seen from afar, and one Greek word means more seen close up, and then even touched. So in our mission, it is about what we say, it's about what people see in us, perhaps from afar, perhaps close up, and the fact that they can actually touch us, we are present there. That's all part of our mission. But in the series, and certainly, I think probably throughout, but certainly over this last few weeks with some excellent talks that we've heard from Sandra and from Jill and from Anthea, we have been encouraged to make this concept of mission more personal. And I've tried to distill that, and I think some of these words have been used before, but I tried to distill that into 3 bullet points. And that is, we've thought about mission in terms of it to be who God has called us to be, to do what God calls us to do, and to go where God calls us to go. And I think that sort of sums up a lot of what we've been thinking about. Mission is about being, it's about doing, and that includes what we say. And it is, yes, about going. It does mean sometimes that we will be called to go out of our safe area, out of our comfort area, and go. That might mean going into Marlow shops and the streets of Marlow. That might mean to go much further afield. But mission is about being, doing, and going. So that's a mission part. Now, how about the book of Acts? Well, quick reminder, the book of Acts is part 2 of Luke's 2-volume work, which he said to the person he addresses it to, most excellent Theophilus, that this is an orderly account. He wants to do an orderly account, a blow-by-blow account of all of the good news of Jesus, from the beginning of Jesus' arrival through to what was current when he wrote it, or not long ago, happened. And in Luke chapter 1, we are in Jerusalem. We're in the temple. And we are concerned with a priest going about his priestly duties in the first few verses after the genealogy of Jesus. And actually, if you read just those verses in isolation, they could have been from the Old Testament, to be honest. They wouldn't be strange in various parts of the Old Testament, just lifted out. By the time we reach, sorry, Tim, camera. By the time we reach where we've been reading this week and culminating in Acts 28, we are somewhere very different. We are in Rome. We are in no longer the religious center of the Jewish faith, but we are in Rome, the center of temporal power at the time, of the Gentile world. Very different. And the question is, how do you get from Jerusalem in volume 1, chapter 1, to Rome, chapter 28 of volume 2? Well, of course, as you do with all answers to questions these days, I asked Google. And this is how you get from Jerusalem to Rome. It will just take you 44 hours in the car. It looks a bit like the route of an old church holiday, to be honest, for those with very long memories. Let it rain. So that's one answer. But leaving aside the fact that transport would have been more arduous in the first century when we're talking about it, in a much bigger sense, the journey was so much greater than that. It was a journey of faith. It was a journey in faith. It was a journey of people leaving behind the old, well-loved values and beliefs to embrace a bigger view of God's heart and plan. It was a journey where the good news of Jesus and God's love broke out of the box that it was in and spilled out into the whole world. And it wasn't, either metaphorically or physically, all plain sailing. It was a journey of storms. Thank you, Lord. Visual aid, which I wasn't expecting. It was a journey of physical storms. We have a visual aid if you look out of the window, and if you're listening to this on video or on audio, you might even be able to hear it. And we'll look at that a bit more in a moment. It was a journey of relational storms. Even going back into the book of Luke, and actually the Gospels generally all record the fact that initially Jesus' family, Mark makes it really explicit, they thought he was out of his mind. They come to try and take him away, stop being an embarrassment. We don't quite get that in Luke, but it does say his family came to see him, and if you read that in the context, and they couldn't get to see him because there's too many people that Jesus was ministering to. If you put that in the context of what we read in the other Gospels, possibly it is all part of the same occurrence. Although that relational storm does play out in the end, one of his brothers leading the church in Jerusalem, and it says that his brothers are in the upper room with the disciples waiting for the Holy Spirit. It's a journey of storms of opposition, stonings, beatings, plots to kill, arrest, accusation. It's a journey of storms of faith with people kind of asking, what is this all about? How does this fit with what we've already believed? And this church, both collectively and individually, we've weathered storms over the years. Going back many years, and indeed even recently. And using all of my experience of over 50 years of walking with Jesus, and probably over 45 of those being in some form of leadership, I have a profound prophetic word for you. Storms will come. Storms will come. However, if we're going to be faithful to looking at the texts in Acts 27 and 28, there is an addendum to that word. Storms will come, but. Now, I know there are many sermons to be preached, many sermons that have been preached, and I think I've preached some of them, of the but God of Scripture. Anyone heard any but God sermons? Yes. Well, you're going to have another one this morning. But first, let's just very quickly, or as quickly as I can do it, remind ourselves of the events of Acts 27 and 28. Who would have thought that my O-level exercises in précis this text would have come in useful? Finally, they have. As I've tried to précis, by the way, O-levels, GCSEs in old money. Old money, that was the money, never mind. Okay. I will do this as quickly as possible. I think it's been mentioned at least once, and definitely Jill talked about this, I think Anthony might have said it, that the events as we go to reach this end of the book of Acts, it really does read like, sound like, a box set thriller, and it is reaching the climax now. So this is Luke speaking, who is with Paul at this point. He's been with him for a little while, actually, in the book of Acts. And he's definitely with him in this. So if you're feeling sorry for Paul, just remember Luke, who's trying to make notes through all of this as well. So this is Luke speaking, and he's putting it in the first person. When it was decided we'd sail for Italy, they're under arrest. Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius. We boarded a ship about to sail for ports on the coast of the province of Asia, put out to sea. The next day, we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, which is great, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there, we put out to sea again, past the lee of Cyprus. The winds were against us. First hint, things aren't always going to go according to plan. When we sailed across the open sea, we landed at Myra in Lycia. Then the centurion found another ship sailing for Italy, put us on board that. We made slow headway for many days, had difficulty. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed again in the lee of Crete. We moved along the coast with difficulty, came to a place called Fair Havens. That sounds great. Well, it sounds like a holiday home, actually. But anyway, much time had been lost and sailing had already become dangerous. Paul warned them, "Men, I can see our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our lives also." But the centurion followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. The harbour was unsuitable to winter in, so the majority decided, and I have to say it sounds like Luke was part of the majority at this point, the majority decided we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix, which again sounds like more like a cowboy movie actually, but there we go. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force swept down from the island. The ship was caught in the storm, couldn't head into the wind, so we gave into it and were driven along. Took a violent battering from the storm, so they began to throw cargo overboard. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, the storm continued raging. We gave up all hope of being saved. And Luke includes himself. After we'd gone a long time without food, Paul stood up and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice." Don't you just love Paul at this point? I think Luke would have, "No, Paul, no." Anyway. We would have been spared the damage and loss, but now I urge you, keep up your courage. None of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. I've got good news and bad news. Last night, an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, "Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up courage, men. I have faith in God. It will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground." On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the sea. Sailors sensed we were approaching land. When daylight came, they saw a bay with a sandy beach. They decided to run the ship aground if they could. They made for the beach, but the ship struck a sandbar, ran aground. The stern was broken to pieces. The soldiers were going to kill the prisoners, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life. He stopped them. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first, get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or other pieces of the ship. But in this way, everyone reached land safely. Storms will come, but what will we do with them? First point. Nigel asked me earlier on, Nigel, stop, if I had 3 points. I have. And if they all began with the same letter. And I said no to start with, because but they do. They all begin with S, because they all begin, storms will come. Storms will come, but what will we do with them? What did Paul do with them? How did he respond? Well, Paul stays on course. He stays true to what he believes God has told him. He seems to know, because he stays listening to God, where he's headed. He says, "God told me you've got to stand trial before Caesar." There were various points in this story where Paul could have escaped, could have run away, I think. But he doesn't. He doesn't run. He stays listening to God, and he stays sharing that with others, which saves lives. He stays on course as a leader. He looks after others. He shows love and care. He prays for them. We didn't go into chapter 28, but he prays for the sick there. In the midst of all these physical storms and the whole storm of being under accusation and arrest, he carries on, taking every opportunity to share what he knows about Jesus. It's quite remarkable. He doesn't focus on himself. He somehow focuses. He's enabled, he's strengthened, he's equipped to carry on focusing on the mission that he feels God has given him. He carries on being who he's called to be. He carries on doing what he's called to do. And he carries on going where he's called to go. well, of course, that was Paul. He was special. I mean, he was special, but he was just a person. Somehow he does it. How? Well, it's probably related to this second point. Storms will come, but God is there. God is there bringing assurance, bringing deliverance, bringing healing, and gathering in. God is there in the midst of the storms. And the storms take them by surprise. I mean, when the storm first blows up, it's just after Paul has found favour and been allowed to visit friends and be encouraged. Anyone ever experienced that? Where things seem to be going actually really well, and then suddenly, bang. That certainly was our experience. Has been our experience. There was a prophetic guy who used to teach in the UK. He's elsewhere now. And he used to talk about that and used to say, quite often you will get a prophetic word, a word from God that is really encouraging and telling you how great you are and how you're strong in God. And then, bang, something awful will happen and then you'll go, well, hang on, how does that fit in with the prophetic word? And his view was God gives you the first word in order to equip you to maintain faith through the troubles. I think that's quite deep. And interestingly, these storms don't disappear. Paul does not stand up in the boat and rebuke the storm. Now, Paul seems to make a habit of copying Jesus a lot, but he doesn't do that. In Luke 8, Jesus does do that for the disciples. You know the story? They're on the Sea of Galilee, a big storm blows up, and he's asleep in the boat, and the disciples wake him up and say, don't you care that we're about to die? And Jesus stands up and rebukes the storm. And then he says something very interesting, and I've never quite seen it like this before. He says to the disciples, "O ye of little faith, why didn't you have faith?" And I'd always read that as, why didn't you have faith to do what I've just done and rebuke the storm? Yeah, most people understood it like that. Well, here's an alternative reading, and I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying this is what occurred to me. Perhaps Jesus is saying, I've rebuked the storm because you haven't got the faith to weather it. Because of your little faith, you can't cope with this storm, so I'm going to stop it for you. But actually, that's on you. I don't know, it's just a thought. Certainly, Paul doesn't rebuke the storm. And we see very clearly in this account that Paul is very aware of God being with him through the storms. He hears the voice of God bringing reassurance, you're not all going to die. He also gets reassurance in Acts 28 in a slightly different way that maybe we can relate to more. And that's when he reaches Rome and believers from Rome all turn out to encourage him. Which led to a joke which made sense back in the days of other breweries, where there's one my dad used to like, which was, how do we know Paul liked a drink? And it's because he went to the 3 taverns and took courage. Anyway, in chapter 28, we read about Paul praying for a whole crowd of people on the island of Malta. We see God working through Paul to gather people in. One of the last verses in the book says, I want you to know that God's salvation has been sent to the Gentiles and they will listen. And that's in verse 27. And in verse 28, the very last verse, we read about Paul walking and working that out. And he is sharing faith whilst under house arrest. Storms will come, but God is there, enabling Paul to be who he is called to be, to do what he was called to do, and to go where he was called to go. And finally, which is to bring hope to the meeting leader. Storms will come, but, and perhaps appropriately it's the last point, storms will come, but they do end. Maybe not as soon as we would like. Certainly not as soon as Paul and Luke and the others on board the ship would have liked. I'm sure they'd have liked the storm to end before they were run aground and the ship was broken to pieces and they had to get to shore. And maybe because they don't end as soon as we would like, sometimes we are able to swim through the storm, and sometimes, like the people in this account, all we can do is hang on to a plank for dear life. And if that's all you can do right now, that's okay. Storms come, but they have consequences. Yes, they'll end, but there are consequences and there is cost. There was cost for Paul and the others in terms of lack of comfort and food, and in Paul's case, freedom. And in terms of the ship owner, they lost a ship. There is cost that we're never promised to be delivered from. Storms may have consequences for us, but in storms, what we are in God is tested and shown. Certainly that was the case for Paul. And finally, storms will end, even if we're looking to the ultimate answer for that. Revelation 21, verse 4, we have the assurance of God's promise for the age to come, when whatever storms we've been through, there will be no more sorrow, no crying, no pain, no death. Love wins. And in the meantime, all we can do is be who God has called us to be, to do what God has called us to do, and to go where God has called us to go. I'll be handing back to Anthea in just a moment, and we're going to be sharing communion together, and she's going to lead us through that. But I'd like to suggest a couple of things as we take communion. Firstly, for those of us in a storm right now, this is maybe a time to reflect that God is there. He is present. And he's given us these symbols to remind us of that, of his body and blood. So as a reminder of the storm he went through for us. And as we take it, as a reminder that he is there with us. And for some of us, we just maybe need to do that quietly in a corner somewhere. And that's fine. For all of us, it's perhaps a time to reflect on our mission. Who are we called to be? What are we called to do? And where are we called to go?